In today's workplace, things are evolving quickly and complexity is the norm, but clarity is a choice. This Week at Work is where leaders get practical solutions and timely insights for today's toughest workplace challenges.
Hello, everybody. I'm Phil Brandt, President and CEO at AIM Employers Association. Welcome back to another episode of This Week at Work. Today, we're discussing a topic that impacts every employer, regardless of industry, size, or geography. That is compensation. For many years, compensation was something organizations reviewed once a year during budget season. Today, compensation becomes a year-round strategic issue influenced by pay transparency laws, talent shortages, employee expectations, economic uncertainties, and increased scrutiny from both employees and regulators. Joining us is one of the nation's leading compensation experts, Michael Maciekowich from Astron Solutions. Michael works with employers throughout the United States, helping them design compensation programs that are competitive, legally compliant, and strategically aligned with business objectives. Mikey, welcome back to the program. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Phil?
Yeah, I'm doing really good. I understand you have a trip scheduled to the National SHRM Conference next week, is
That's
it?
right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so
So
that's in Orlando, and you're going to be stopping and visiting with Kyle at our office in Orlando and hosting a roundtable as well, correct?
that's right. Monday morning from 9:30 to 11:30, we have a roundtable scheduled, very much on this topic that we're going to be talking about, but in more of a discussion format with the members that will be attending. But again, obviously it's an important issue if we're hearing everywhere and questions about it. So it becomes really important. And then in National SHRM, we are exhibiting there. So, look us up. If anyone's going to the National SHRM, stop by. We got all our little tchotchkes and things we can give you. And also my partner, Jennifer Loftus, is presenting this year at the National SHRM on pay transparency on
Oh, yeah.
Tuesday afternoon. So,
Well, I'm sure Jennifer will do a great job as she
yep.
always does. And I know there's not many options actually. I looked at the list for compensation. So hopefully your booth will be busy and I know our members that I've already talked to are planning to stop by that are
Okay.
attending. So good luck to you and Jennifer
Thank
and
you.
the Astron crew. I know that's going to be good. Before we dive into the three major topics, let's start with the labor market. The latest report shows that unemployment remains relatively low. Wages are continuing to rise, and organizations are still competing aggressively for some very
Mhm.
coveted talent. From your perspective, what are the compensation leaders paying the closest attention to right now? What should
Yeah.
we be looking at and paying attention to, Mike?
Yeah, I really think there's two reports that we need to track, and that I could recommend. Of course, the BLS, the obviously Bureau of Labor Statistics. When you look at consumer pricing, for example, when it just came out for May, overall consumer prices were up 4.2%. Well, now you start thinking about, wait a minute, though, last fall everyone was saying that cost of living adjustments would only be around 3%. So wait a minute, what's going on? Well, obviously the war in Iraq
Well,
has had
we've had a
a big
war and
impact.
and
Right,
that driving up fuel cost along
right,
with other things. Yeah.
right. So if you take out fuel, it actually, and food and fuel, it's closer to 3%. But still, when you have that 4.2% in there, it is something to watch, right? To consider. I mean, obviously, if you are unionized, your union fellows are watching that because they'll be coming back to the table, right, with those statistics and trying to put some pressure. Well, wait a minute,
The
our
cost of
3%
living
is not
index.
working
Yeah.
anymore, right? So we have to keep watching that report. And then another report that we have adopted more than anything else is the ADP National Employment Report that comes out once a month, and it also has a pay insights report. Now think about ADP. So they have this database of This one includes 26 million employees nationwide.
Ooh,
And they're using Stanford. So they have Stanford University is doing the analysis, and they're actually looking at real data in all of their, members that they have. And so if you start tracking year over year, let's just talk about generally how much pay is going up. In their
yeah.
world, it's been going up on an average of 4.4% year over year. Well, that's a far cry from those 3% that you kept hearing from, the major houses last fall. Well, just do a 3% adjustment, you'll be okay. But that's really purely just merit. Normally, they're just giving a recommendation on, the merit program. But when ADP is looking at it, they're looking at all types of adjustments. So they're looking at merit, they're looking at market, they're looking
Yeah.
at promotions, everything. And it's interesting when people change jobs, that number jumps up to 6.6% year over year. So you've got to
Okay.
kind of keep a watch on that because that's reality, right? That's
So
no
we
longer
still have, yeah, so
projections.
it sounds like we still have some of what we saw during the Great Resignation that, okay, I'm going to stay in my job and I'm hearing, some organizations say three, 3.5. The reality is closer to 4.5. But if I
Mm-hmm.
leave and I get a new job or I get promoted, maybe and stay with my same employer, that's going to be my opportunity to bring in and rake in over 6%.
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
And the other interesting trend in their pay insights, they break it down in very detailed demographics. And one of the demographics is by age, right? Taking that 26 million database and breaking down, well, what's the average increase by age? And it's very interesting that the highest increase are for the youngest people, 16 to 24. Those folks are getting close to a 10% from year over year, right? So you're
Mm.
seeing a lot of trying to keep them, right? The Gen Xers that are coming in, Gen Zs, do they want to stay? How am I going to keep them? Do I promote them along career pathing? All those things you give them, right?
Yeah, well, you said the Gen Xers. I know you meant some of
Millennials. I meant
the
millennials.
Gen
Yeah.
Z, and
Yeah.
yeah, because I'm a Gen Xer, and I
Yeah. You
mean
guys
that
get
I get
nothing.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you have to earn it first, Mike, and that's always important too.
Well, and boomers, we're kind of just hanging on. So as I'm a boomer, and that's interesting for my generation, the average year over year adjustment was 3%.
Yeah,
But for
yeah.
Gen
So I
Z,
think
it was 10%.
what you're saying is not everything is equal,
Correct.
from, one size fits all, 3%, 4%,
Right.
5%,
Right.
doesn't matter. What you're saying is that the job role, the age of the
Right.
individual and their learning
Yep.
curve, their contribution
Mhm.
abilities, all these things are making a difference in who gets what percent that makes
Right.
up this total of,
Right.
4.5%.
And I think that's the biggest misconception we have is that people just see that, oh, they're projecting 3%, for next year. That covers everybody. It
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah.
And
So,
you get in trouble with that, right? Because now not only are you not dealing with the individuals, but you have to look at certain positions. We all have, every organization we work with will identify what we call mission critical positions. Those are jobs that we have to keep filled. We have no choice. Well, they're making decisions around that, right? We're going to maybe set the market at the 60th or 75th percentile for mission critical versus other positions. So again, we're starting to see this
mhm.
decentralization of the decision making because that's the reality of our business. We have to keep these positions because without them, we're not in business anymore.
Okay, well, that's maybe a good segue into pay transparency. I think probably anyone watching this recognizes that that's a very hot topic. Anyone in the HR field has been confronted with pay transparency
Yeah.
issues. Many leaders support transparency philosophically, but they
Sure.
worry about, what happens when employees start comparing compensation and what's happening
Mhm.
across the country and they start talking about it. And while, there are legal rules and laws that allow people to talk about their
Mhm.
pay today, and we've moved away from confidentiality of pay,
Sure.
it still makes management very uncomfortable. Let's just break that down a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what is it when we start talking about pay transparency that we should be thinking about as business leaders?
Yeah, I think that because I know the first reaction is, well, I'm in a state where I'm not required to do it, Missouri. You
Yeah.
know, so if I don't have a law, why should I worry about that? I mean, although we're up to 25 states now, so it's starting to become more and more the norm. I'm sure over another year or two, that's going to change even for Missouri. So eventually we'll have legal requirements. And then also, the thing we have to consider is again, our Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, they're requiring it, right? In
Yeah.
fact, there was a Gallup survey that found that over 40% of Gen Zs, when they're looking for an employer, that's one of their number one issues. How transparent are they about their compensation program? So that's a change, right? If he asked the
Yeah.
boomer
No, that
back in
is
the
huge.
days,
Yeah.
yeah, we could care less. We just wanted the job, you know. So those become issues that become very, very important. So I think from a concern of an employer or from a business standpoint, the concern is that pay transparency automatically leads to discussions of pay equity, right?
Mm.
Because as soon as you're transparent, then, and now I have data that I can now question. Why am I being paid that way? Because now I know what that range is. And
Yeah.
obviously, and you hit the nail on the head, I can now talk to my peers in my department or around the company and say, well, what are you making? Right? There's nothing to stop us from having
Or
that
or I can go
discussion.
post it online.
That's
Yeah.
right. In fact,
Yeah.
that generation is even more in tune online. They share, hey, I just got a job. This is what I'm paying. What do you think? I've seen
Yeah.
those posts.
Yeah,
And
I have
by the
too.
way, last week I attended a LinkedIn webinar that talked about how to be sure you're paid properly. Now, get this, you're going to love this one. Employers, listen. There were over 2,000 people on this webinar for an hour, and the leader talked about how you go in to negotiate a better salary. And on top of that, one of the keys were be sure you talk to your peers and you share that information so you have the data. So when you walk into your boss, you can say, well, I know what Mary's making. So you need to take
Mm.
care of me as well. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
pressure with this. Think about
Oh
all that
yeah. No.
pressure that this has created. Again, the intent was to make sure pay was more equitable because we're not hiding it, right? So a
Yeah.
female would now know that they're being paid a certain way. We better take care of that. And so that's a real issue in terms of, when you have this, it really comes down to are you really prepared to allow that information out? Meaning that you have to do it, you need to do it, but have you looked at your system first to be sure that, have we answered the questions in advance
And I
that will
think that's
come
the
up?
nuts and bolts of it, right? I
It
mean,
is.
look, we work really hard as employers to build trust with our
Mm-hmm.
employees, and I know our AIM members, for the most part, are very, very responsible employers, and
Sure.
they work hard to build trust. They spend lots of money to build trust and energy to build trust. Compensation is that one foundation block to
Sure.
me that when you can explain your compensation philosophy, when your
Mm-hmm.
supervisors can talk about how we determine fair pay for the jobs that we have, for the people that we have in those roles, for their tenure in the role, for their tenure they came into the company with, then what that does is that supports the trust effort that you're building,
Right.
right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
often we think, oh, that's going to create more problems. I think it lessens the problems because it answers one of the most important questions of why they're there, and they're trying to earn their living and they want to make sure they're getting their share.
That's right.
Um,
That's right. And I think it really starts with the foundations of your compensation program. If you think about it, a lot of clients that we work with and members that we've worked with, we find out that they've really never taken the time early on to establish a compensation philosophy. Or,
yeah,
why do we pay what we pay? How do we define that? How do we define the market? How do we deal with internal equity? How do we recognize different skill sets? All of these things are the kind of the foundation of the decision making. It's the
yeah,
blueprint, so to speak. But if you have that blueprint, then you can start sharing some of that information so that now you're educating everyone, right? And I know we're going to talk about supervisors and managers, but even educating our employees on the basics of this is how we're making these decisions. Now, you may not agree with that, but being transparent about how
right.
we do that builds the trust. We're not hiding anything. These are decisions we made, and there's a reason why we're making those decisions. So I think that's what really helps. So, yes, the nuts and bolts of equity and being sure that you don't have any issues, you want to be sure you review that, but you have to have that foundation so that you now have something you can build your communication around. And I think that
Right.
sometimes is really missing.
Yeah, so it's beyond compliance. I mean, the
Yeah.
ABCs of
Oh, yeah.
compliance, look, you have to do
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Um, and that's our members are good in the space of compliance, but then it
Right.
gets to building trust through transparency. So the takeaways, I think, for someone that's listening to this podcast for me is like you have a pay audit, you have a salary structure, and
Right.
you review that. You have your philosophy of what you want to achieve. You're documenting that.
Right.
And then from there, you're making all the adjustments and communication, which really starts with your senior leadership, one, understanding and being aligned, and aligned
Right.
with the concept that we are going to prepare our managers and supervisors to be a part of the communication channel. And that's the newer side of compensation that I'm
Mhm.
seeing. We've always had managers be able to select, well, you can select somewhere between 3.25 and 3.5 and how much you want to give an employee for a raise. You get that flexibility as a manager. But to be able to talk about how it was determined, what
Right.
I'm getting, and how we
Mhm.
know that that's fair, that's the takeaways. And I
Right.
know from working with you, in almost every case, you're doing all of those things with our
Right.
members and your clients.
Yeah, it's very, very important. Again, you're right. It starts at the top, and that really is where your philosophy and strategy is being set. And also, that's where the alignment is going to happen too, in terms of the business strategy, right? Because compensation is really a way we reinforce and support what the organization is trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
It's a way we communicate what's important so that when somebody is paid a certain way, if it's linked very clearly to what we're accomplishing as a business or as an organization, now I can understand why I'm getting paid at that level, right? So all of those things it really starts coming together when you think about all the different pieces that are there. Because without that connection, you don't have your blueprint on your strategy and your philosophy, which makes it difficult to do an audit because you don't know if you're really fulfilling what you need to do. And then once you do that and you feel comfortable with that, how do we now communicate that in such a way that, everyone can understand that? And of
Yeah.
course, the real linchpin of all that communication are our first line supervisors and managers, because they're the ones that the employee is going to look to, not HR, not to, leadership. They're going to look at their boss and say, why am I paid what am I paid? Or do you get it? Do you understand this program? And if they sit there and go, well, go talk to HR, we've lost them. We've lost
Yeah,
them.
you've already lost them the moment that you say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm aligned with that. I know you always include that in the
Hmm.
work that you do, that
Yep.
opportunity to train supervisors and managers on the
Yep.
model. Let's move on to compensation as like a strategic business
Yep.
lever. One of the things that I know you always focus on is that this should not be simply an HR function
Hmm.
exercise. I hear you share and argue that it should be treated as a strategic business decision. What does that mean? I think I
Yeah.
get it when you say that, but break
Yeah.
that one down for us. It's a
So,
strategic business decision.
yeah. So it's like when we decide what product we're going to create, or what services we're going to provide, or how we set our costing, right? How we set our
Hmm.
prices. When you think about all those decisions that are being made, there's a reason we're doing that. There's a strategy around that, right? If we want to be number one in selling air conditioners, right? So there's a lot
Yeah,
of issues that are going on. There's a quality issue, right? There's a distribution issue, marketing issue, a
yeah,
pricing issue, all kind of things are going on in your discussion. So think about that when we're pricing a job, right? When we look at a job, somebody's position, that the same types of decisions should be made in terms of, are we competitive, just like we want to be competitive in our products and services? Should we not take the time to be sure we're competitive in how we are paying people for the services they're providing us? So you
yeah,
start taking the same ideas of a strategic plan that we spend a lot of time on, and know everybody gets together and they have these 3-year plans. Well, why don't we have a 3-year compensation plan? A strategy that says this is where we need to be 3 years from now, and what should that system look like? Because we need to be sure we have the right people in the right positions in order to support where the organization wants to go. So I think
yes,
there's a linkage that's missed a lot of times, that they see this as just a way to distribute money, right? We're distributing money to people. Well, no, there's more to that, right? In
yeah,
terms of how we're setting that. And I think that's what we've been trying to spend more time with senior leadership, is to show the connection, that you've spent the time on developing your strategy on your product, your services, your marketing, whatever that is. How is compensation now going to reinforce that and support that, right? Because you're sending messages, right?
yeah,
If, for example, a traditional merit pay is not going to work real well for an organization that's aggressive, trying to grow a business in multiple territories, right? They need to be looking at, should we not be reinforcing results and outcomes, or efforts that people are making towards that expansion? So, you start linking your performance and your other decisions to the organization's strategic plan.
yeah. So you're moving into like, the return on investment and
Sure.
measuring compensation is I start to hear the direction you're going here.
Hmm.
Um, and of course there are employers that are like, oh, well, we don't have any compensation problems. They don't know. They haven't looked at it. They
Okay.
haven't studied it, but no one's complaining. So that's just not our focus today. But
Right.
how would or what are some of the methods to measure the return on on compensation spending or adjustments? Because it's my opinion that some organizations steer away from working with someone like yourself
Hmm.
because they really don't want to know, well, you might want to increase your budget as it relates to comp, or you might want to change the compensation model that you have, because all of those things start to feel very uncomfortable, increasing a budget or changing the model. I hear
Right.
you're saying you change it over 3 years. No one wants to change everything abruptly. That's not
Right.
always a
Right.
smart thing to do. But what are some of the measurements for the return on investment?
Yeah, I think this is where we need to link a couple different worlds together. And to me, compensation, this is where human resources and finance come together from that standpoint, meaning that, finance is sitting there, your CFO. In fact, I always like to meet with CFOs as part of a project because to me, there's an insight that they're bringing in terms of, well, what are the gains that we're trying to do as a company? The financial gains, right? Because return on investment is a financial measure. So you're sitting there saying with the CFO, so HR working with the CFO, first of all, to understand what is the company's objective or the organization's objective. Okay, and how we then define that, but usually it's defined somewhat in financial terms, right? And whatever the cost of the services are, or the cost of the goods we provide, the profits that we're looking at, but then what are the costs to do that, right? So,
Hmm.
so when we start looking at, well, we need to be competitive in our mission critical positions and retain people because if we don't have them, we're not going to meet those financial gains. So, therefore, how do we now calculate? And very simply, it's total financial gains minus your human resource cost that you have. And that's generally your return on investment, right? Is it a positive or is it a negative? So there are some, you can get into the minutia of that, but in general, the concept is being sure you're understanding or and having an education between HR and I think finance and even some others on senior leadership that what we're providing is the support to be sure we have the talent in order for the organization to meet those objectives, let's say the financial objectives that we're looking for. And so the cost to do that, are we getting the right return? For every
Yeah,
dollar we spend in retaining our talent, which means that's your benefit program, that's your pay program, it's your rewards program. So for all those dollars that we're putting into that, have we now got a positive return in terms of keeping that together? If not, there may be something out of sync, right?
sure.
And that's a fair discussion. We're spending all this money on this talent and we're losing money on this product line, or we're losing customers, or we're losing members. Well, if I'm spending all this money and I'm not getting the return that we were expecting, something's out of sync. And that's a
Yeah.
good way to test whether, it's working the way it should.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of factors that go into all that, and compensation is one of them that should, in my opinion, must be measured as part of it.
Yes.
Um, let's talk about the manager readiness test because I like this, and I know you're going to talk about this with our team next week in
It's okay.
Orlando when you meet with them. But there's really like three great questions to ask a manager
Mhm.
that I would expect my manager could answer these questions. So
Right.
this is a practical three-question test. Why am I
Right.
paid what I'm paid?
Hmm.
What do I do? What do I need to do to earn more?
Hmm.
And how does my compensation compare to the market? Like a manager should be able to answer those
Those are
three
basic.
things.
Those are
Yeah,
basic things. Those are. And so what we've been trying to do is, since this is all part of a rollout of your full compensation program, those are the three key things, right? In terms of what an employee is thinking. I think a simple way to, first of all, we got to give managers a tool. Supervisors and managers, they need something to lean on. They need a crutch, right? Because they're not compensation experts, nor do we want them to be compensation experts.
right.
However, they need to know the basic answers. And so what we've been doing is developing FAQs, right? Frequently asked questions, give them a cheat sheet in advance that we can go through and say, when you get this question, here is your basic answer, right? In terms of what you need to say. And that way, if they have that, and also the key is consistency. If you then give that out to all your supervisors, and let's say in a staff meeting with your supervisors and managers, you go over that and be sure they understand that information, you're starting now to get that consistent response out there. And people are
Right.
hearing the same thing from no matter who the manager is, because they're going to talk to each other afterwards and say, well, what did your boss say?
Oh,
And
they're going to test it. Right.
they're going to test that for sure. So I think that becomes very important, and I think it helps with confidence and trust. I think the more our supervisors feel better about, okay, I have a basic understanding, then they have, first of all, confidence that they can talk about it. But secondly, they also are trusting that there's been a lot of thought put into this program. This wasn't just something
Yeah.
we threw darts at the board and made up what we're going to pay people. So I think it becomes very important from that standpoint, because the more they feel more confident and they trust the program, it's much easier for them to have that conversation. But I
Yeah,
think consistency
absolutely.
is so critical when they're doing that. And, that's the other part. The down part of transparency recently has been that managers have become afraid, because now that there's so much transparency out there, I'm afraid to make any decisions because
Yeah.
everyone's going to know. So what are they doing? I just had one of your members actually called me about, they found out that on their pay for performance program, they were all giving everybody in the middle, 100%, no difference, because they were
Okay.
afraid that if they made a distinction, somebody would talk about that, and they didn't feel confident enough that they could say, Phil, you really are a better employee, so I'm going to give you a 4.5%. And, Mike, you're just getting by, so you're getting a 2.5. They didn't feel they could do that. They actually asked their managers, why is everybody getting the middle? And it's because they were afraid.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough spot.
oh, it's
It's
very
it's a
tough.
tough spot if I'm not being shared, if I'm not shared the strategy and all the things we just talked about and why.
Right.
It is difficult to administer these things in a way that can stand the test that we just talked about. Those three questions, I'm going to
Sure.
just repeat them. I think
Sure.
they're really good questions. Why am I paid what I'm paid?
Mm-hmm.
Every manager listening to this today should be able to answer that question. What do I need to do to earn more?
Right.
Is it even possible for me to earn more? And then how does my compensation compare to the market? Those are three
Right.
great questions.
They
Mike,
really are.
let's do a lightning round. And here's what I mean by a lightning round. I'm going to read a statement and I just
All
want
right.
you to give me the best, fastest, most comprehensive, concise response you can. All right.
Okay.
Very quick. I got five questions for you. What's
Okay.
the biggest compensation mistake employers make?
Biggest mistake is assuming one size fits all.
Most overrated compensation practice?
Is relying on information that is very general and not
Yeah.
making it more specific to our organization.
The most underrated compensation practice?
Oh, the most underrated is actually decentralizing our compensation. That the more
Okay.
we do that, we'll be making better decisions.
All right. One thing every CEO should know about compensation.
That compensation is critical to your strategy and your success.
All right. Here we go, Mike. Last one. What will compensation look like in 5 years from now?
Totally different. It's going to be, I can tell you basically, I believe that it is going to be, first of all, even more decentralized in terms of addressing mission critical jobs and different aspects, different types of jobs. Number two, more emphasis on career pathing. That's going to continue to grow with the generation that's pushing that, especially now Gen Alpha that's coming in. So we're going to see more of that. We're going to see less reliance on base pay adjustments and more on variable pay,
Yeah.
recognizing efforts, but linking that to the success of the organization as well.
Yeah.
So
No,
I think
I
all of
think
that's going to continue to grow. I think so.
those are some very good, solid responses, Mike. Thanks for that. I mean, I always appreciate you sharing your expertise. One with me, I always learn something, and I know we've been working together for 10 years. And
Yeah.
what I love about your advice is that it is practical. I've worked with all the big firms. Your advice is so practical and realistic that it's able to be digested and deployed in a way that I know business leaders really like in that. I know as organizations are approaching compensation strategically and differently than they have before, and recognizing the challenges, I think, of attracting and retaining just the right people,
Mhm.
your compensation models really become important. And if you would like to, talk with Mike or learn a little bit more about what he's doing, you can reach out to us here at AIM. You can reach out specifically to Matt Weidman. That's Matt.Weidman, Wideman at aimea.org. And he will be happy to arrange a time for you and Mike to sit down and have a good conversation about where you're at and what you're thinking about, where you're going. But as always, Mike, thanks for being on the program.
Well,
Good luck next week at the National SHRM Conference. And most
right.
importantly, with our members, I appreciate you taking some time to
No
help
problem.
them along. We will be back next week, Bert Garland and I. But before then, now let's go out and be good to someone. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.